On a January morning, when the wind is so sharp it feels like it's scraping the trees clean, a question comes to mind. It's a simple question, the kind you might ponder by a fire. How did Native American communities not only get through winters that could break a person in a single night, but plan for them so well that the cold became a season of work, storytelling, and community instead of just a crisis? The answer starts with a skill that our modern lives, with thermostats and salted roads, have mostly let us forget. They learned to read winter long before it arrived. Because let's be honest, it's a lot easier to defeat a snowstorm on a warm day in August than it is in the middle of a January blizzard. Across the entire continent, communities meticulously timed their harvests, their home repairs, and even their moves, all based on this understanding. They knew that once the snow starts falling, it's not open to negotiation. Their calendars weren't paper on a wall. They were living things, kept in songs, in ceremonies, and in amazing visual records like the Plains Winter Counts, where each year was marked by a single, memorable event that anchored time for everyone. The architecture of warmth. Now, here's a reveal that might surprise you. Snow itself is an incredible building material. When you shape it correctly, it's a phenomenal insulator. Why? Because snow traps a huge amount of air. A well-cut block of compressed snow can insulate just like a modern wall, as long as you keep it dry. For Inuit families on travel routes across the sea ice or wind-packed drifts, this wasn't just a neat trick. It was a survival tool. They could build snow houses, or igloos, with incredible speed, laying spiraled courses of blocks that lean inward. This inward lean is key. It means the structure's own weight locks it together. The real genius, though, is in the details. The entrance wasn't just a hole in the side. It was a tunnel dug below the floor level. This acts as a cold trap. Cold air is dense and heavy, so it sinks and gets caught in the tunnel, preventing it from spilling up into the living space. It's simple gravity, working on air just as reliably as it works on a stone. Then, the sleeping platform was carved to be higher than the doorway. Why? Because warm air rises. This simple design choice ensured that the warmest air in the entire structure pooled exactly where people were resting. It sounds like clever theory until you feel it yourself. Inside one of these structures, with a small stone lamp burning, the temperature could hover right around freezing, maybe a little bit above. That might not sound like much, but when the air outside is a life-threatening -30, freezing feels like a gift. Of course, not everyone lived in snow houses. In places like western Alaska and along the Bering Sea coast, permanent winter houses were often built partly underground. They were roofed with whatever was available: driftwood, sod, and mats of tundra that would freeze solid into a single, protective shell by December. The earth packed around the walls blocked the wind and buffered the temperature swings. A raging blizzard outside became just a muffled sound, not a reason to panic. Over on the northwest coast, among the Haida and Tlingit, you'd find massive cedar plank houses. These things were built to face storms head-on, with thick walls that shed relentless rain and held in the heat from huge central fires. They even engineered the smoke management. Roof boards could be lifted or shifted to control the ventilation, because they understood a critical rule of survival. Bad air will defeat you faster than cold air. They preferred to choose their enemies. Meanwhile, in the northeast, Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, towns were famous for their longhouses. These were built from a frame of saplings, covered in sheets of elm bark. Inside, hearths were spaced down a long central aisle, and smoke was vented through openings in the roof that could be adjusted with bark flaps. The longhouse wasn't just a piece of architecture, it was a social map. Families were clustered by their matrilineal lines, and heat and cooperation were concentrated together. French missionaries who visited in the 1,632 wrote in their diaries about the incredible winter stores of corn, beans, and dried squash they saw hanging high up under the bark roof. This kept the food in the warm, dry air and safely away from rodents. The missionaries complained about the smoke, sure, but they had to admit the houses just plain worked, especially when the snow was piling up deep around the Onondaga and Mohawk villages. Out on the northern plains, tipis made from bison hides, and later canvas, were strategically placed in river bottoms. There, the cottonwood trees acted as a natural windbreak, and vital resources like water and fuel were right there. In the winter, they'd add liners and an interior awning called an ozan. These additions were brilliant, trapping a layer of warm air and helping to channel smoke. The smoke flaps at the top, controlled by long poles, could be angled to work with the wind, to obey it, rather than getting into an argument with it. It was this same logic that Lewis and Clark learned when they spent the winter of 1804 to 1805 near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages on the upper Missouri. They saw the earth lodges rising like domes from the frozen ground. With their thick earthen walls and a central smoke hole, these lodges turned a bitter, frozen valley into a functional, warm neighborhood. The explorers very quickly decided that copying this design was a whole lot smarter than suffering through the winter on their own. And down in the southwest, adobe villages like Taos and Acoma perfected a different kind of climate control. They used south-facing walls, small windows, and the sheer thermal mass of their earthen buildings to their advantage. The thick walls would soak up the heat from the low winter sun all day long. Then, as the air froze hard after sunset, the walls would slowly release that banked heat back into the homes. A wall can be a battery, if you build it right. The cliff dwellings you see at places like Mesa Verde show the exact same principle at work. The deep rock overhangs cut the wind and dramatically reduced heat loss. Archaeology stops being poetic and gets down to business when it starts measuring wall thickness and solar angles, and those measurements make a powerful case for winter survival that echoes across centuries. Of course, a well-built shelter is only half the battle. Survival isn't guaranteed if the cold can still climb through your sleeves and the sweat freezes inside your boots. That's why clothing systems were engineered just as carefully as the houses. The quiet killer in sub-zero weather isn't just the cold, it's moisture management. Get wet, and you're in serious trouble. The Inuit and other related peoples developed a brilliant solution, the caribou skin parka. This wasn't just one layer of fur, it was two. The inner layer was worn with the fur facing in, trapping a layer of warm air directly against the body. The outer layer was worn with the fur facing out, creating another insulating air pocket. This double-layer system kept body heat right where it needed to be. And caribou hair is special. Each hair has a hollow shaft, which adds an incredible amount of insulation. It's the kind of brilliant design detail you really start to appreciate when your face stops stinging from the cold. Their boots, called mukluks, were just as ingenious. They typically paired tough sealskin soles with caribou or other fur uppers. They were soft enough to allow for good blood circulation, which is crucial for keeping your feet warm, yet tough enough to grip the ice. And crucially, the boot liners could be taken out and dried every single day. Because as anyone who's spent time in the cold knows, you will never, ever win a cold snap with wet feet. Even the thread they used was a piece of technology. They used sinew, the strong, slightly elastic fiber from the backstraps of large animals. When sinew gets damp, it swells, which seals the stitch holes. A seam that actually tightens itself against moisture is the kind of trick that seems like magic until you remember it's just biology put to clever work. And to protect their eyes, they carved snow goggles from bone, antler, or wood. These weren't sunglasses. They were a solid piece of material, with a narrow slit cut across them. This simple design drastically cut down on the blinding glare from the snow, protecting their eyes from snow blindness during long days out on the bright, white snowfields. The same people who carved these also knew the importance of planned travel breaks, because rest is a technology too, even if nobody ever wrote a patent for it. In the woodlands, the go-to material was brain-tanned buckskin, made from deer, elk, or moose. It was breathable, incredibly soft, and easy to repair. It worked well as outerwear, or as a lining against even warmer fur layers. When European wool and cloth arrived through trade in the 1600s and 1700s, people started mixing the old and new fabrics. But when the temperatures really plummeted, the older, traditional knowledge about staying dry and blocking the wind still won out. That fur ruff you see around the hood of a parka wasn't just for decoration. It created a boundary layer of air right around the face, warming it slightly and catching ice crystals before they could form on your skin. Hunters knew to sweep this frost away with a brush, not to rub it in, because one lazy moment could turn a life-saving parka into a frozen, useless sponge. Fueling the fire. Of course, none of this matters if you can't generate heat and light in the first place. So, fuel management became a winter art form. You know how good flour makes good bread? Well, good wood makes a good fire, and people who lived by the flame treated their woodpiles like savings accounts. On the northwest coast, cedar was prized because it burns hot and splits clean. Stacks of it would be piled by the houses long before the first November storms rolled in. In the Northeast and the Great Lakes, hardwoods like maple, oak, and birch were the fuel of choice. They burned slowly and steadily, which is exactly what a long winter night demands. The design of the tipis and longhouses worked because they gave smoke somewhere to go and warm air somewhere to gather. It sounds simple until you try to do it without creating a bunch of cold drafts. Flaps, vents, and liners effectively turned the walls into moving parts. Gaining just a few degrees through smart design is the difference between a cozy evening of storytelling and a long night of shivering. In the Arctic, where wood is scarce, the quillic, a stone lamp, was the center of the home. It burned seal or whale oil using a wick made of moss or plant fiber. This single lamp provided heat, light, and a surface to warm water and dry out wet clothing. But it required constant attention. The flame had to be tended to keep it burning clean and to minimize soot. Tending the flame was a crucial daily responsibility that enabled everyone else to keep moving and working. No matter the heat source, a dry sleeping platform was essential. Whether it was made of planks, hides, or woven mats, its purpose was to lift bodies off the cold ground, because direct contact will steal your body heat much faster than the air will. Bedding was constantly rotated toward the hearth to dry out. It's a routine that sounds incredibly dull to talk about, until you wake up one morning and find your blanket frozen solid in a curve on the floor. The winter pantry. Even with a good fire and good clothing, what you eat determines how a winter day feels by noon. Food preservation and storage were so important that they shaped the entire calendar of travel and work. What you managed to hang up in October would decide what you'd be boiling in February. From the Columbia River all the way up to Tlingit country, racks of drying salmon would stand like fences in the late summer. The air in the smokehouses would be sweet with the promise of midwinter dinners. The sea could storm for days on end. So the wise move was to use the magic of airflow and a low, steady fire to make the river's abundance last for months. On the plains and in the subarctic, they made pemmican. This was a powerhouse of nutrition. Dried meat pounded into a powder, then mixed with rendered fat and sometimes berries. When it was sealed properly, it was a calorie-dense food that would not spoil. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, huge trading operations like the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company relied entirely on Cree and Métis pemmican to fuel their canoemen on long, frozen journeys. That's a pretty strong endorsement from people who were paid to move fast. In the Great Lakes region, wild rice was harvested in late summer and early fall. It was parched to dry it out, then threshed and winnowed. This process resulted in a clean grain that stored well and cooked up quickly in the winter. A bag of rice in a canoe or a storage cache could turn a cold day into a hot meal in minutes, which is a morale boost disguised as a starch. Haudenosaunee farmers and their neighbors would dry rings of squash, store shelled corn in bark barrels or cribs, and put up shelled beans by the basketful. This ensured a steady supply of protein and fiber to get them through the storms. Winter meals were built from these stores, because the frozen ground is not generous in January, no matter how persuasively you ask. To protect this precious food from dampness and animals, people across many regions, from the subarctic to the plains, used cache pits lined with bark or grass, or sometimes built raised storage platforms on poles. In Alaska, Inupiat communities near the coast dug ice cellars into the permafrost. These natural freezers kept whale, seal, and fish stable through the long cold spells. They acted like community banks, with established rules about access and sharing. Because none of the technology, none of the ladders or pits, mattered without rules about who eats when a storm lasts longer than anyone planned. These sharing norms and obligations weren't just nice slogans. They were survival math that even the children could recite long before the first ice crusted over the ponds. Travel was its own winter skill, because staying put isn't always an option when the traps need checking or the woodpile starts looking a little too small. To get around, one of the most elegant and widespread technologies was the snowshoe. The principle is simple. Spread your weight over a larger area so you can float on top of the crust and powder, instead of sinking up to your waist. But the designs were anything but simple. They were highly specialized, regional answers to local snow types and the density of the forest. Long, narrow Huron and Algonquin-style snowshoes, for instance, were perfect for moving fast over open frozen lakes. Meanwhile, Ojibwe and Cree patterns found a balance between length and width, making them ideal for mixed forests and navigating riverbanks. Out in the Rockies and the subarctic, groups like the Sambar-K and their neighbors used shorter, wider frames that were perfect for floating on the deep, soft powder you find in spruce and birch country. When French and British newcomers arrived in the 1600s and 1700s, they borrowed these snowshoe designs so completely that many of their winter journals read like a student's notebook. The fact that they still tripped and fell all the time isn't an argument against the technology, it's just an argument for practice. Further north and west, dog teams pulling sleds were the key to turning bulky, heavy loads into gliding errands. They could cover huge distances across sea ice and hard-packed snow. The routes they followed weren't random. They often stuck to windswept ridges and the frozen surfaces of rivers. A smart traveler lets the landscape remove the obstacles for them, instead of fighting every single snowdrift with pride and a shovel. Out on the plains, both before and after the arrival of the horse, a travois, a simple A-frame sled, was dragged behind dogs or horses to carry tipi poles, hides and supplies. This was crucial when winter camps had to move to more sheltered river bottoms. Mobility wasn't a luxury, it was a core strategy. A frozen river bend with plenty of firewood will always beat an exposed hilltop that has great views and frostbitten ears. And how did they find their way? Navigation was a sophisticated mix of memorizing landmarks and reading the sky. But in winter, the snow itself became a map. Wind-scoured snow, called sastrugi, forms lines that point in the general direction of the prevailing winds. A clear night full of stars, combined with a snowpack that records the wind's direction, creates a map that literally updates itself every hour. That's more than most of our modern apps can promise when it's 30 below. The hunt in a hardened world. Of course, a lot of that travel was in the service of finding food. Hunting and trapping strategies had to shift right along with the season, because animals change their habits when the world hardens over. Beaver, for example, could be taken from under the ice, where their runs between their lodge and their underwater food cache created a predictable path. Snares for snowshoe hare were set along the tracks they wrote for themselves in the fresh snow. In the Arctic, massive caribou migrations could be intercepted at narrows and river crossings that had been known for generations. Hunters would use the wind and the terrain to keep their scent down and their approach calm. On the plains, deep snow could slow down or even stop the big bison hunts. But when there was a winter kill, the processing had to be fast, a race between knives and warm hands before the carcass could stiffen into an immovable, frozen lesson. Fishing also adapted. People would fish under the ice using lines, hooks, and sometimes even nets that were set through a series of holes. The steady, quiet rhythm of checking the gear kept hands moving and minds focused. Pulling up even a few fish on a bitter day could change the entire mood of a village, which tells you something profound about the power of a hot soup. The tools for these tasks evolved, from points made of bone and antler to steel blades that came into communities through trade. But what always mattered most was sharpness, not the origin story. A dull tool is a thief. It steals your time and your body heat, and winter will not lend you either one of them back. The Library of Winter. This incredible wealth of knowledge about building, clothing, hunting and traveling had to be passed on. It was moved with the same care as any other precious resource, because a plan that only one person holds in their head is a plan that's waiting to collapse. Stories, demonstrations and practice runs in the fall were essential. They taught younger people how to cut snow blocks, how to set snares, how to dress hides, and how to pack a sled long before a mistake could become fatal. Winter itself was a time for learning. Long nights in the winter houses were the perfect opportunity for elders to lay out the proper sequences for tasks, to explain the exceptions, and to deliver critical warnings. Ceremonies often doubled as a form of knowledge transfer. An audience might laugh at a storyteller's well-timed joke, but they would also leave the gathering with a mental checklist for survival, cleverly disguised as a narrative. Medicine and daily care were a huge part of the winter toolkit. People drank spruce tea for vitamin C, and used steam sweats to clear their lungs and dry their clothing with controlled heat. Avoiding frostbite and respiratory illness wasn't just about comfort, it was about labor protection. A sick camp quickly falls behind on the essential chores of hauling wood and water. And water itself is a quiet winter challenge. The daily habit of melting clean snow or chipping river ice into kettles was non-negotiable. Storing liquid water near a heat source and rotating the containers prevented dangerous shortages, It's a task that's much more exciting to talk about in July than it is to actually fix in the middle of January. Tools for starting a fire from fire drills to flint and steel, and later, matches all had their place. But redundancy was the rule. Everyone knew that the one tool you accidentally drop in the deep snow is always the one you're going to need an hour later. And finally, there was the constant management of the wind, both outdoors and in. Wind is designed to remove heat, so people designed ways to stop it. Windbreaks made of brush or snow walls would be built around camps. Tipi doors would face away from the prevailing blast, unless the smoke demanded a compromise. Inside the houses, space was organized by temperature. Heat-intensive work happened near the flame, while tasks that were resistant to the cold could be done closer to the door. The wise person did their quick chores closest to the draft, and saved their careful, detailed work for the warmest corner of the room. A management style that every modern office could probably learn from. Timekeeping in winter didn't follow the arbitrary puffery of clocks. It followed the rhythms of light, temperature, and the specific order of jobs that needed doing. Dawn meant it was time for fuel checks. Midday, when the sun had a little bit of power, was the time to dry out any wet gear. And the evening, when the fires were burning their brightest, was for cooking, repairing tools, and telling stories. The distribution of food wasn't left to chance or charity. It followed well-established plans that were set long before hunger ever became an issue. Elders and children were prioritized, and the hunters and workers were given the fuel they needed for the next day's tasks. The point wasn't just to be nice. It was about maintaining the stability of the entire system. And stable systems are what last through the storms that break the improvisers. It's also crucial to remember that no single region offered everything. Trade routes and alliances were the threads that connected different winter economies. Coastal oils and inland furs moved along familiar paths, and meetings were planned so meticulously that even a heavy snow couldn't cancel an agreement without a serious, concerted effort. The arrival of European goods certainly changed the materials. Iron knives cut faster, steel needles could pierce heavier hides, and wool blankets joined the traditional hide robes, but it didn't change the fundamental winter logic. The checklist for that first freezing night of the year stayed exactly the same, asking the same old questions about heat, dryness, calories, and cooperation. Historians sometimes get into debates about whether a certain practice began in one specific place or another, or they argue about the exact dates for house styles that obviously evolved over very long periods. And those debates are important for getting the details right. But when you step back and line up all the evidence, the houses, the clothes, the food, and the social rules against a long map of snow, the shared pattern is crystal clear. A dry sense of humour also earned its place in the winter toolkit, mostly by keeping spirits up when the sixth storm of the month arrived uninvited. People would joke about the person who boasted that they loved winter the most, while conveniently sitting closest to the fire. And that joke is still funny today, because the physics of it remain absolutely correct. Archaeology, oral history, and the earliest written accounts all start to fit together best when you track the consequences of these practices. A well-cited winter camp shows evidence of fewer emergency moves. The bones and teeth of the people who lived there show better health indicators. And you find fewer notes from outsiders about desperate last-minute bartering during the cold months. When railroads, trading posts, and new laws started to press in during the 19th century, these winter strategies had to bend, but they didn't vanish, because at their core, they were adaptable. Families simply added new tools to their old rhythms. You can see the evidence in old photographs, where wool coats are worn right over traditional fur hoods, and metal stoves are glowing inside of log houses. In many regions, after the intense bustle of the fall harvest and the big hunts, winter actually became a season for repair and storytelling. In a way, all that planning was its own kind of rest. Tools were mended, clothing was re-sewn, and the decisions of the past year were reviewed out loud, so that the next year's mistakes could be fewer. Even leisure served the plan. Drumming kept hands warm and busy, and indoor games often trained a person's aim and stamina in tight spaces. You can tell a culture truly values winter skill when its games are quietly rehearsing the exact motions that will be needed outside, tomorrow at dawn. The obvious question, of course, is whether any of these skills still matter now that we have ploughed roads and humming furnaces. And the answer is yes, they absolutely do. Because storms still knock out the power, and working remotely won't split your firewood or boil your water when the pipes freeze. Modern outdoor clothing borrows shamelessly from the logic of the caribou parka, trapping air in synthetic lofts and controlling moisture with vented shells. Engineers are quietly thanking the ancient seamstresses who figured out how to stop leaks with swelling stitches, even if that credit line is a little bit overdue. Urban planners are rediscovering the benefits of south-facing windows, thick walls, and windbreaks, and they're calling it energy efficiency. Which is fair, but it's not new. If you can keep a house warm with just fire and stone, you can certainly help a city block waste less heat with glass and brick. Emergency managers now teach us to have go bags and caches of supplies, and they make checklists that would look deeply familiar to a Haudenosaunee farmer counting their barrels on a cold afternoon. The vocabulary has changed, but the physics and the common sense have not. The real heart of the winter strategy isn't some romantic dance with hardship. It's a stubborn refusal to be surprised by predictable events. Snow will fall, the wind will rise, food will run low if you don't plan, and fires will go out if they are left unattended. These are rules you can bank on more safely than money. Each region answered the same questions differently because every landscape demands different ideas. Ice, forest, prairie, and canyon, each one shapes a unique skill set. And the people who survived the longest were the ones who answered the call of their own land, rather than trying to argue with it. If you go looking for a single, magical trick, you'll miss the entire orchestra, where all the different parts have to play in time. Housing, clothing, fuel, food, travel, and social rules only work because they work together. A weakness in any one section makes the whole symphony sound thin. The theme of dryness appears in every single chapter of this story, because wet is the enemy of warm almost everywhere, unless it's inside a cooking pot, on purpose. Fires dry out your boots, vents release the steam from cooking, and your clothing materials have to breathe so that sweat doesn't get trapped where it can hurt you later. Quiet endurance always beats dramatic moves in the cold months. That's why you hear more stories about checklists than you do about duels with the wind. If someone ever tries to sell you a single tool solution for winter, you have my permission to go warm your hands by a fire and completely ignore their sales pitch. The most practical kind of optimism you can find in the historical record is how people simply assumed winter would come and then acted accordingly. No one held a vote on whether January should exist, which freed up a lot of time for more useful work, like mending snowshoes and patching roofs. Because these strategies were built over generations, they carry memory just as much as they carry technique. A sewing pattern is also a family map. A route across a frozen river is also a list of names, whispered to confirm who showed it to you first. That's why the stories about winters gone right are not just comforting, they're instructive. They carry the warnings about the pitfalls and the tested answers, so the listener leaves with a complete plan disguised as a good story. Modern climate swings are delivering some strange winters, for sure, but the old framework still helps, because it's all about preparation and adaptation, not fixed recipes. When the snow comes late, or it melts and refreezes into a sheet of ice, the person who knows many different methods has more choices than the person who only knows one. When you strip away all the romance, winter is a mechanical problem with very human consequences. Heat must be made, kept, and shared. Water must be liquid for at least part of the day. The calories you consume must outpace the work you're doing, and the airflow in your home must be kind, rather than cruel. The elders who taught a child how to place a log so it burns clean were also teaching time management. A fire that demands you panic and tend to it every hour ruins the day. A steady flame frees your hands for better tasks. The same logic governed where you'd pitch a tent or raise a roof. Small slopes and benches shed cold air like water, while hollows and valley bottoms collect it like a bowl. The person who learned to sleep just a few feet higher than that cold pool woke up with warmer toes and a much better mood. Even tool storage followed winter scents. Lanyards, loops, and predictable storage places save minutes that feel like absolute luxuries when the wind is rising, because losing a mitten in a snowdrift is a lot less funny at midnight. By now, you can probably see that what looks like a long list of tricks is actually a complete way of seeing the world. The land becomes a set of cues, the house becomes a machine for living, and the day becomes a series of choices that either admit the cold or banish it. The people who lived by this framework didn't fear winter so much as they deeply respected its rules. The result wasn't bravado, but competence. Competence reads pretty quietly on the page, but it feels like profound relief in the middle of a storm. This first look has stayed with the big picture. Shelter, clothing, heat, food, travel, and the social rules that make them all sing together on the worst nights. The heart of it all is simple enough to carry into your tomorrow morning. Set the stage in fair weather, and winter becomes a season to manage rather than just a test to survive. If you're hoping for a miracle, the miracle is how much a person can accomplish with just snow, wood, stone, and discipline. And the best part is that discipline weighs nothing in a pack, which makes it the lightest and most important tool you can carry into the cold. The physics of a warm room. The easiest mistake to make in winter is to think that heat only lives in a fire. The older, wiser rule is that heat lives in the design. A single doorway in the wrong place can waste more warmth than a small fire can even make. This is why careful builders treated a winter house like a finely tuned machine. On the Norton Sound coast of Alaska, back in the 1870 seconds, families would cut their entry tunnels below the floor level, forcing any incoming cold air to have to climb against gravity before it could reach the main room. A smoke hole high above the hearth would lift the warm air out slowly, while cross vents could shape the draft. The effect was a steady, stable interior climate instead of a flickering, drafty one. Travelers who visited wrote that you could physically feel the difference between the freezing wind and a workable interior just by the height of the sleeping platforms. When the platform sat just a handspan above the main floor, the air was significantly warmer right where bodies were resting, while tools and boots could dry on the colder, lower level without getting cooked. A detail that's often missed is that these winter rooms were often built with rounded corners. Cold air circulates more gently against curves than it does against sharp angles. Rounded ceilings would guide any drips back down to the walls, and the walls would radiate the heat back toward the people. It's a good trade on any night. This same intense focus on airflow was alive and well inside the cedar plank houses on the northwest coast. Builders would intentionally leave controlled gaps between the roof boards and align the smoke holes with the prevailing winds. If the wind shifted, a new board would slide into place or a screen would be turned, and the house would answer the weather like a person turning their shoulder to a gust. The cedar walls held a dry, resinous heat, but they also kept moisture from creeping into the bedding, because damp blankets are a slow-motion disaster. The thick corner posts would store the warmth of the day and pay it back at midnight, the sort of loan everyone is happy to accept. Back in the northeast, the longhouses arranged their hearths down the center so that neighboring fires could share their warmth without starving each other of air. Families cooked on their own stones, but the entire building breathed through an aligned series of vents, and smoke would rise in braided columns that could be trimmed and managed by bark hoods. As we mentioned, missionaries complained about the smoke in their 17th century reports, but they also had to admit they were comfortable in the dead of winter, even when the gales were pressing hard on the walls. The people using the house had already solved the comfort problem with good design and daily routine, and they weren't eager to fix what was already working. Out on the northern plains, the earth lodges roofed with willow, grass, and packed soil could concentrate heat so well that the interior stayed workable even through blizzards. The entrance passage wasn't straight. It turned at least once, so the wind would meet a solid wall rather than the living space, and a small trapdoor could be lowered at night for extra protection. Lewis and Clark wrote about these lodges in the Missouri Valley, noting the thick walls, the central hearths, and the common habit of hanging meat and tools up high, where the warm air gathered. They ended up copying what they saw for their own winter quarters at Fort Mandan, because smart visitors are quick to admit when the local engineering wins. Further south and west, the Pueblo towns leaned their walls to face the low winter sun, and they counted on the adobe to store that midday heat for the long night ahead. Thick, stacked rooms created sheltered courtyards where the wind would just fall flat. And because neighbors shared walls, much less heat escaped into the open air. Cliff houses, carved into natural alcoves, reduced their exposure in two directions at once. The rock overhangs stopped the wind from above, while the specific sun angles helped to warm the stone from the front. Archaeologists have tested this story with modern temperature readings, and the data pattern perfectly matches what a family would have felt as dusk settled in. The war on water. A second skill that was carried across nearly every region is one that looks deceptively ordinary: the strict control of moisture in clothing and bedding. Cold really does its worst work through water, because wet fibers stop trapping air and become useless. So, people learn to prevent dampness from ever starting, rather than trying to chase it away with bigger and bigger fires. In the Arctic, As we've touched on, seamstresses would cut two parkas from caribou skin. One was worn with the fur facing the body, and one with the fur facing out. The hollow caribou hair trapped air in both directions, and the whole system was designed to bleed moisture into the outer layer where the dry wind could just whisk it away. The sinew thread they used, taken from the back or legs of animals, would swell in damp seams and lock the stitches tight, which kept the wind from sneaking through the tiny pinholes. That thread also stretched just a little bit under stress, so the cuffs and hoods stayed comfortable whether a person was working hard and sweating or frozen still on a long watch. The boots, built from sealskin soles and fur uppers, kept feet warm, so long as the liners were religiously rotated and dried on racks near the heat. Travelers who ignored that daily schedule learned very quickly that your own sweat is not a small issue when the smell of frost is sitting over every trail. And those goggles, carved from bone or wood with a narrow slit, didn't just reduce the blinding glare. They also kept your eyeballs from reflecting heat away from your body like tiny mirrors. There was a quiet joke in some of the old accounts about the person who scoffed at the funny-looking goggles in the morning and then was desperately trying to borrow them by noon. In the woodlands, brain-tanned buckskin was cut to breathe and flex, so it would shed snow and dry out fast by a fire. People kept spare moccasin liners ready as if they were made of gold. When trade goods arrived, they were layered over or under the traditional hides to fine-tune the system. But the core logic of ventilation and moisture control always stayed in charge. Banking calories for the cold. A third essential skill governed food, because in winter, calories decide whether work is even possible when the sun is small. The processes of drying, smoking, and rendering fat were what turned the short, explosive abundance of summer into the long, quiet security of winter. And that work always began months before the first frost. Wild rice, gathered from the marshes of the Great Lakes in late summer, was parched in kettles. This process loosened the hulls and thoroughly dried the grain for long-term storage. In the middle of January, that same threshed rice could be poured into boiling water and feed an entire camp without burning hours and hours of precious fuel. That's why it mattered so much. The maple sugar season was what carried families through late winter and into early spring. That magical window when the days get warmer but the nights stay cold enough to pull the sap up from the tree trunks. The sugar made during this time was stored in hard cakes that travelled well and could sweeten lean stews. It carried a memory of the trees right into the last hard weeks of winter. On the plains and in the subarctic, pemmican was the king of stored energy. Pounded dried meat and rendered fat were mixed and sealed in rawhide bags that were tough and airtight. The fur trade brigades of the early 19th century were almost completely dependent on these high-energy bricks, which came from indigenous expertise married to the relentless schedules of the canoe routes. Along the rivers of the northwest coast, smoked salmon was hanging in the houses and smokehouses by the time late summer rolled around, so that winter meals were a decision, not a wish. A small, oily fish called the eulachon was rendered into grease, storing an incredible amount of dense energy in beautiful carved wooden boxes. And that grease moved along the trade routes, because good fat is basically civilization when you're facing a cold wind. In the Arctic communities, ice cellars dug deep into the frozen ground could hold meat and fish for the entire year. Families monitored the permafrost in their cellar like a grocer checking the temperature of a cold case. When the sealers returned to the village with news of a big catch, the neighborhood already knew exactly where the extra cuts should go to be stored safely for everyone. A fourth skill, and this one might be a surprise to people who think the best winter plan is to simply stay home, govern travel. The reality is that winter rarely allows for complete stillness. Traps need to be checked, wood has to be fetched, and the vital routes between families and trading partners must stay alive. The solution, of course, was the snowshoe. By multiplying a person's footprint across the snow, these incredible tools allowed for travel in conditions that would otherwise be impossible. And the local shapes were perfectly matched to local conditions, because a spruce forest, the surface of a frozen lake, and an open prairie all ask for different answers from a traveler. The long, narrow frames were perfect for gliding quickly across lakes, while the shorter, rounder forms floated best in the deep powder you find under the trees. When French and British travelers showed up in the 17th and 18th centuries, they borrowed snowshoe technology completely. They then wrote a lot of sheepish notes in their journals about falling down over and over again until they finally learned the rhythm. They also learned to hang their snowshoes high up in camp at night, because a dog chewing through a rawhide binding can absolutely ruin your day. Dog teams and sleds, meanwhile, turned heavy loads into sliding errands across the vast distances of sea ice and on wind-packed trails. The drivers learned to read the drifts and the pressure ridges the way a sailor reads the waves. Their trails almost always favored the hard-packed snow and the frozen highways of rivers, because a good route is one that spends energy sparingly, instead of wasting it by punching through deep drifts. Out on the plains, travelers used a travois, a simple drag sled pulled behind dogs and, later, horses. It was used to haul tipi poles and all the other bundles of a mobile camp, especially when wood or water ran low in one spot. These winter camps often moved down to the river bottoms, where the cottonwood trees would break the wind and where a ready supply of riparian wood was waiting. Navigation systems used the sky when it was clear, and the ground when it was cloudy. The wind itself carves the snow into lines, the sastrugi, that line up with the prevailing flow. A person who kept their eyes sharp could read the story of last night's gusts on the surface of the snow and make some very good guesses about what lay just past the next ridge. The social machine. A fifth skill, and maybe the most important one of all, focused on community rules. Because the best technology in the world will collapse if individual households start hoarding fuel or food during a long storm. Many communities operated with clearly defined sharing obligations that acted like insurance policies. These customs were designed to absorb the shocks that came when the hunting luck swung wildly from good to bad. Elders and leaders held the authority to redirect resources when a storehouse was threatened or a family ran into serious trouble. And that authority came with the expectation of generosity. A person who ate well during a storm and then refused to help the community when it broke could expect to be met with long memories and very poor cooperation the next time they needed something. Work duties were arranged by age and skill, which kept the houses running smoothly even on the worst days. You had wood choppers, water carriers, cooks, and fire tenders, all assigned by a known pattern rather than by a random whim. These routines freed up everyone's decision-making time for the hard problems and, most importantly, they prevented chaos, which is not a small benefit when the frost is making everyone's fingers clumsy. Community houses, like the Yupik Kaskik, served as winter schools where boys and young men could train, learn the important stories, and practice using their tools under the close eyes of their elders. The family houses, called Ina, stood nearby, and the steady exchange of tasks and teaching between these two spaces strengthened the entire community, which of course was the point all along. In the Pueblo towns, the kivas provided a ceremonial and social space during the winter, where knowledge was moved forward through prayer, storytelling, and choreographed action. But the room itself, with its sipapu, its benches, and its ventilator shaft, was also an education in air and heat management, because the room only worked when it was tended to correctly. And back in the northeast, the day-to-day life in a Hodnozorny longhouse taught cooperation by its very design. The roof and the walls were held in common, and the series of shared hearths demanded a strict schedule and a lot of trust. People learned to wait their turn and to share hot coals, because a well-run house needed fewer arguments and, as a result, fewer repairs. The housekeeping that is engineering. A sixth skill often appears to us as simple housekeeping, but it was really a form of engineering. The daily dance with airflow and smoke. Tipis used liners and an interior awning, the ozone, so that the air would rise cleanly from the fire and then circulate back down along the sides. The smoke flaps at the top were adjusted to the wind with just a twitch of the poles. If you set the flaps wrong, you'd smoke everyone half awake, which was a pretty immediate reminder that winter rewards attention more than it does bravado. But if you set them right, you could create a clean column of lift, a warm ring of air near the floor, and a measurable drop in how much wood you needed to burn by bedtime. The earth lodges admitted light and air through the roof holes that also served as smoke exits. A man carrying a bundle could even climb out through the top to clear away snow from the opening after a heavy fall. The job looked simple, but it felt heavy in deep drifts. Still, the room rewarded that work with fresh air within minutes. The plank houses of the northwest coast used interior racks to dry clothing and fish near the ridgeline. This is where the warmest air gathered, but it was also high enough that sparks from the fire wouldn't land there. The walls were never wasted space. People treated the vertical surfaces as storage, a clothes dryer, and a windbreak, all at the same time. And in the Arctic, the stone lamp, the quillik, required continuous attention to the length of its wick and the level of its oil. Otherwise, it would smoke and cover all the cooking surfaces with soot. The women who tended these lamps learned the perfect angle and the right cut by feel. The success of both the evening meal and the day's repairs depended entirely on their steady hands. The seventh and final skill is one that stayed quiet until someone forgot it, and it's all about planning your movements to avoid pools of cold air and to maximize the Sunday. Cold air is dense, and it flows downhill, collecting in low spots just like water. Because of this, camps that were set up on small benches just a little ways above the valley floors meant waking up with warmer lungs than the camps that were set up right in the hollows. In open country, experienced winter travelers learned to sleep on slight rises rather than in the bottoms, even if the rise looked more exposed to the wind. The wind might pass a little harder, but the actual air temperature would stay higher by dawn, and the morning fire would need less wood to cheer everyone up. Houses were leaned to the south whenever possible, to recruit the low winter sun through small windows or doorways. This simple choice made the mornings much easier to start. Even in deep cloud cover, the habit of turning toward the light helped to dry out clothes and tools, which in turn kept the day from sliding into serious trouble. Fuel planning followed this same geography. Frost bites the hardest on those exposed ridges where wood is scarce. So, crews would spend entire days in the fall cutting and stacking wood in places they knew would soon be covered by snow-covered trails. The winter days always felt better when the woodpile was waiting for you, instead of the axe waiting for you. Travel schedules also favored early starts. In the morning, the snow is often firmer and can carry more weight, and the air is usually still. The afternoon winds are what sculpt the drifts and steal your time. In camps with small children or sick adults, the duties were adjusted to keep this master plan intact, which is exactly what a good plan is for. Historical sources sometimes bicker about which group invented which specific trick, but field tests tend to end that argument pretty quickly. If you sit inside a well-vented longhouse, a snug earth lodge, a round cedar house, or a tight snow house in the middle of winter, you stop worrying about slogans, and you start thinking about dinner. The evidence in the earth. Archaeology is what adds the dates and the physical proof that anchors all of these practices in a specific time and place. And it usually confirms the oral record, rather than erasing it. The village at Ozette, on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, is a perfect example. It was buried by a mudslide in the early 18th century, which preserved the Maca plank house life so clearly that the drying racks and repair kits found by archaeologists still tell their own stories. In Alaska, near the Bering Sea, sites like Nunalak outside of Quinnipiac have yielded intact parkas, tools, and house fragments from centuries before any Russian contact. These finds show the exact same relationship between air, heat, and moisture that modern seamstresses and hunters still rely on when the wind comes up. On the plateau of the interior northwest, archaeologists have studied the pithouse villages at places like Keatley Creek and Bridge River to understand what it was like to live underground during the winter. Radiocarbon dates and the layers on the floors show repeated repairs and clear seasonal use. The structures they've uncovered match exactly what logic would demand in a place with such deep snow. In the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Valley, the written historical record from the 17th century lines up perfectly with the storage pits, the bark containers, and the grinding stones found in excavations. The recipes for survival were buried in the mud, and then dug up centuries later with the same ingredients listed in the oldest stories. Across the subarctic, travelers like Samuel Hearne, writing in the 1770 seconds, described Dene and Cree winter travel with snowshoes, caribou hunting by frozen lakes, and the use of spruce boughs for bedding. His work certainly carries a colonial bias, but his practical notes on the tools and techniques match what today's trappers still know to be true when they read the wind and the ice. On the plains, during the early 19th century, artists like George Catlin painted village life, including winter camps along the rivers, and the earth lodges that carried smoke up through their round roof openings. The paintings confirmed what the visitors wrote down, and what the descendants later explained. This is how multiple kinds of records can strengthen each other. And down in the southwest, the chroniclers who travelled with Francisco de Coronado in the 1540 seconds, and later Spanish accounts, all noticed the masonry villages that were oriented to the sun, and a winter schedule that clearly favoured indoor work. They didn't love the cold themselves, but they could see that the houses had turned it from a sentence into a season. The colonial period brought iron tools, wool blankets, and firearms. But the fundamental winter framework did not change, because the fundamental problems of winter did not change. People adopted what helped, and they kept what worked. That's why you can see photos from the late 19th century of people wearing wool over their traditional hide clothing. There were also, of course, forced changes and terrible losses when governments and companies disrupted access to land, traditional food routes, and the seasonal rounds of life. That history belongs to another part of this story. But even in those decades of immense strain, it was the underlying knowledge of winter that kept families alive during the cold snaps that the new rules did not soften. One detail that's worth pausing on is the use of time in winter, because when work is stacked into well-worn routines, warmth becomes much more affordable. The morning fire was for drying out whatever needed to travel with you that day. The bright midday light was reserved for repairs and hide work. And the evening heat was for pushing the cooking and conversation into the comfortable hours. Children learned chores that pulled them into this well-oiled machine without needing big speeches. They would gather the small wood or lay out the drying lines for the mittens. The tone was always steady, rather than heroic, because steady is what wins when the storms decide to arrive one after another for a week straight. Medicine and care routines were designed to protect lungs and skin, and they mattered just as much as the thickness of any wall. Steam and sweats in controlled lodges or rooms warmed up muscles and dried out clothing without needing an open flame. And various herbs and teas were used to replace the missing vitamins that the short daylight hours tried to steal. The reason all these details ring together so tightly is that winter compresses mistakes. A missing vent, a damp boot, a poorly stored sack of rice, or a forgotten snowshoe binding, these things don't wait for a gentle season to teach you the lesson. That is why these 7 skills are easiest to see as one single, integrated system, rather than a loose bag of tricks. Planning the house, the clothes, the fire, the food, the travel, the rules, and the use of the land's own physics works because each part lifts up all the others. And when modern people adopt pieces of this system, they often find that the results feel immediately, intuitively familiar. A sealed home with controlled vents, layered clothing that breathes, meal prep that reduces fuel consumption, and map travel that avoids the low spots, it all feels like common sense. Because it is. Engineers now call these moves passive design and efficiency. But the names don't change the physics that gave them birth beside the rivers and in the snowfields, long, long ago. The physics always smiled on the people who took the time to remove surprises in fair weather, and that smile was always warmer in January. A regional tour of winter wisdom. If you listen to the first-person accounts from the 19th century, a certain line repeats itself in different words. The person who paid attention to the air, the dryness, and the calories kept moving. And the person who didn't pay attention paid for it in frostbitten hands or in entire families put at risk. Let's take a tour and see how this played out in specific places. In the far western subarctic, in late December, Athabascan families would settle into their semi-subterranean houses. These were framed with spruce and sealed with moss. The roofs were built to take the weight of heavy storm snow without sagging, and as the weather got colder and damper, the moss plugs in the walls would swell, closing up any cracks, as if the house itself could breathe and heal. Thick layers of spruce boughs were laid across the sleeping platforms, creating a springy, insulating layer that trapped air and wicked away moisture. And every single morning, someone would take those boughs outside and shake them, dropping the night's accumulated frost far away from the bedding. Left alone, that frost would melt and soak right back into the room. They would fetch snow to melt for water in birch bark baskets, which were nearly weightless. Because birch bark doesn't easily soak through, and because hot stones could heat water from the inside out, they could use a technique called stone boiling. This let them simmer stews right inside the baskets or in wooden troughs, without cracking pottery, saving both fuel and dishes. By the time the Little Ice Age rolled through in the later centuries, from roughly 1,600 to 1,850, the colder winters pressed much harder across these northern forests. The response wasn't panic. It was thicker walls, deeper food caches, and a stricter schedule for wood runs that never, ever waited until the pile looked small. Now let's travel to the Pacific Northwest coast in January. Here, Tlingit and Haida communities would be working inside their massive cedar plank houses. The walls of these houses were split, not sawn, which kept the long wood fibers intact for maximum strength. The huge corner posts held carved histories, but they also held heat, which made art and engineering the exact same object. Cedar's natural oils resisted rot in the wet winter air, and the people would split shakes to shed the rain and to vent the smoke without drowning the fire. Racks were suspended high up under the ridge beams to dry fish and clothing, right where the warm air gathered but far below where any sparks could reach. When the winter gales would hammer the inlets, the houses were built to face the water at an angle, rather than straight on, because wind and waves always prefer a direct target. The canoes would be pulled high up onto the shore and lashed to racks, waiting out the storms with their precious ribs safe, just as important to the next calm day as any stored salmon. Over in the Great Lakes, Anishinaabe families would shift to their sugar camps late in the winter, during that period when the nights stayed freezing and the days began to thaw. They'd tap the maple trees and boil the sap down into hard cakes. Those cakes essentially stored the energy of spring in a dry, portable form. They could sweeten lean stews and keep energy levels steady while the ice was finally breaking on the lakes. When the year without a summer hit in 1816, chilling growing seasons across huge parts of North America, the communities that already leaned on a diverse pantry of dried fish, wild rice, and maple sugar had buffers. These buffers weren't magic, but they were enough to bend a potential catastrophe into a manageable inconvenience. Let's move to a February on the northern plains. Here, the Mandan and Hidatsa people would be living in their earth lodges along the Knife and Missouri rivers, with smoke rising from the round openings in their roofs. Inside, families would gather by the hearths to mend their tools and to plan for the next bison hunt, which would happen once the snow thinned out on the prairie. As we've mentioned, visitors like Lewis and Clark noted the thick walls and the clever turning entrance corridor that kept the wind from blasting into the living space. But they also copied the local drying methods, hanging their meat and their moccasins up high where the warm air collected, rather than just leaving them to smoke and hope for the best. When the bison herds moved differently after deep snows, the hunters had to adapt. They would use the river bottoms as natural drive lanes, and they would save their arrows and bullets for clean, efficient shots. Waste in winter is a luxury that winter refuses to pay for twice, and the people who learned that lesson lived longer. Further south, the Pueblo towns relied on the thermal mass of their adobe walls to catch the low winter sun on their south-facing surfaces. This warmth would then bleed back into the rooms long after dusk. They used small, high windows that admitted light while defending against the wind. A compromise so ancient and effective that modern architects sometimes rename it and issue a press release. The kivas, those circular ceremonial rooms dug into the ground, doubled as winter classrooms where stories, protocols, and practical lessons were carried forward. And those rooms only worked their best when the ventilator shaft and the roof opening were perfectly balanced, which turned a ritual space into a hands-on physics lesson. On the northern edge of the southwest, Diné families used woven blankets and robes, layered over their shirts and dresses, to manage the cold mornings on the high plateau. The introduction of sheep added wool to the older clothing systems, but the core logic still ran on breathability and dryness, not on brute thickness. And back in the northeast, the Haudenosaunee longhouses stretched out like communal spines, with their hearths spaced down the center aisle. The winter's supply of corn, beans, and squash was dried and stored overhead in bark containers because the rising heat favored both the food and the people. Winter diplomacy would sometimes happen right there, around those hearths. Visiting delegations would be seated and fed before any serious talk began. Hospitality was much more than just courtesy in January, because a warm guest becomes a reasonable guest in about half the time. The finer points of motion and meals. People moved through these frozen forests, where trails vanished under the white, on snowshoes laced with rawhide. As we've seen, the styles shifted by region. The Huron and Algonquin people used long, narrow shoes to fly over the frozen lakes, while the Ojibwe and Cree designs were wider to provide more float in the deep powder under the spruce trees. Under-ice fishing brought up whitefish and lake trout through holes that were measured by habit and often marked with spruce boughs to keep the snow from hiding them again. Nets could be set under the ice between a pair of holes, turning a morning's work into a week of meals, which is a trade anyone is happy to accept. In the high Arctic, their sleds, called kamutiik, were a masterpiece of engineering. They were lashed together with rawhide, not nailed with iron. This was critical. In the extreme cold, the lashings tightened in the dry air, and the whole structure was allowed to flex as it went over the rough sastrugi, rather than shattering, which is something a rigid, steel-bolted sled never learns how to do. The mushers knew their route markers better than any map, from the exact silhouette of a certain headland to a ridge where the wind always scoured the snow down to pure ice. On overcast days, they could read the grain of the snow itself to choose their direction, and the lead dog in the team often just confirmed what the driver already suspected. A hunting detail that deserves real emphasis is the deliberate balance of fat and protein in their winter diets. Many northern communities warned against trying to live on lean meat alone. Eating just rabbit and other slim cuts could literally starve a person even with a full belly, a problem that modern nutritionists gave a name to much later. Pemmican solved that balance perfectly by mixing the dried meat with rendered fat in ratios that could keep a person's strength up on long trips or through long storms. The method traveled widely because a good idea tends to ignore borders. You can see this knowledge in action in the cameras that were turned toward Alaska in 1925. The famous Serum Run to Nome was completely dependent on Alaskan native mushers and their dog teams moving medicine across storm-blasted country. They were operating with winter tools and knowledge that were far older than the telegrams that were announcing their progress. And every single mile of that journey rested on their trail sense and their meticulous care for their dogs. Back in the 19th century, Cree and Métis families were producing pemmican on a scale that could feed the brigades of the Northwest Company and later all the posts of the Hudson's Bay Company. In fact, the 1814 Pemmican Proclamation, an order that tried to restrict this trade, caused a serious conflict, not because the food was unusual, but because it was absolutely essential to the entire economy of the North. In the interior plateau of what is now British Columbia, the Secwepemc and Lakapamuks people would go underground for the winter, living in pit houses that had roof smoke holes and laddered entrances. Excavated floors from these sites show the hearths, the storage pits, and the specific repair areas that confirm a winter economy that was focused on maintenance and measured work. At Ozette, on the Olympic Peninsula, that landslide from around the early 18th century sealed a Mucka village and preserved winter life in a cedar time capsule. Archaeologists found the cordage, the baskets, and the racks all still in place. Detail on top of detail that turned oral history into a room you could actually stand inside. And back in the subarctic, the Dean travelers described by Samuel Hearn in the 1770 seconds carried kits that included spruce gum for repairs, sinew for bindings, and a special tinder fungus that could catch a spark reliably every time. His attitude in his writings was uneven, to be sure, but his notes on the tools themselves match exactly what northern workers still pack when the forecast looks harsh. Little arts of a large season. One quiet winter lesson is to treat light itself like a resource, to be harvested and then rationed. The reflective snow makes the midday incredibly bright, even when the sun is sitting low on the horizon. So, the chores that needed good light were always clustered into that window of time. This saved both fuel and eye strain. The wolverine fur used around parka hoods was known to resist ice buildup better than almost any other pelt. This is because the smooth guard hairs simply refused to hold onto the frost. People who learned that fact stopped scraping at their faces all the time and just let physics help out their cheeks. On the northern plains, the tipi liners created that rising column of warm air, while the interior awning, the ozone, trapped the heat above the sleeping spaces. If you set the smoke flaps correctly, the draft would pull just enough air to keep the center fire burning clean, which reduced both wood use and coughing in equal measure. The sites for these tipis in winter almost always favored the river groves, where the cottonwoods would break the wind and the snow would load up gently along the trunks, rather than building up into massive drifts in the open ground. A sheltered camp is a quiet camp, and a quiet camp saves calories. Further east, the Wabanaki people would move between their coastal and inland sites with the seasons, using toboggans to haul their gear over the snow without sinking. The simple runnerless sled can slide where a wheeled cart would fail miserably, which sounds obvious until you see someone try to use the cart. Under-ice spearing in the northeast offered another source of winter protein, practiced by fishers who knew the channels and the right ice thickness by heart. The holes were cut with care, marked, and then revisited, because the smartest fisher is always the one who lets the pattern do the heavy lifting. A health rule that's threaded through all of this is the need to keep your lungs clear and your body flexible, all without wasting heat. The sweats that took place in controlled houses or lodges warmed up muscles, dried out clothing, and allowed people to wash without opening the doors to a wind that was just waiting to take its tax. In the villages along the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, winter festivals like the Messenger Feast or the Bladder Festival would sync up the communities after the long hunting seasons and move knowledge along through song and story. These events also marked the transfer from one set of seasonal tasks to the next, which kept the community calendar honest. The cache pits in the woodlands were lined with bark and grass to shed moisture, and the lids were cleverly disguised under leaves and snow. The raised caches on poles in the north kept foxes and bears from helping themselves, which proved that good carpentry is also good security. A quirk that modern campers are constantly rediscovering is the value of bench camping, setting up your shelter just a few feet above a valley floor to avoid the pools of cold air. Cold sinks like water, and a tiny little climb can buy you a much softer dawn, which is a trade that's always worth the extra steps the night before. Weather reading went beyond just looking at the clouds. People would watch for the rings around the moon that warned of ice crystals high in the atmosphere and a likely change in the weather. A halo in winter might mean that wind was on the way, and that meant pulling extra wood inside and adding extra lashings to the sled. Routes across the tundra often used eskers, the long, gravel ridges left behind by old glacial rivers, as reliable, natural high roads that stayed above the deep drifts and slush. Travelling on an esker in January could save you hours of slogging, and time is heat when the daylight is short. In the wood-rich regions, families would sort their firewood by species, because not all logs are created equal when a stew needs to simmer for hours. Birch and maple in the northeast gave off a steady, even heat for cooking, while cedar on the coast would add a quick, hot flame for a lamp or a small tool repair. Even the layout of the tools around a hearth followed winter logic, with knives placed where hands could find them in low light, and wet gear hung where the heat was real but not scorching. A misplaced glove is a joke in July. It's a real problem in January. That's why the hook by the door had a name. The snow houses used on the high Arctic travel routes sometimes used a combination design called a carmack. This would pair snow walls with a skin roof, depending on the conditions. The mixed design allowed for a much faster setup when the daylight was already fading, a choice that trades aesthetics for survival with absolutely no regrets. Food fermentation in the Arctic and subarctic added another layer of preservation, turning fish and meat into safe, stable stores when they were handled correctly and watched carefully. The flavors are strong, to be sure, but strong flavors are easy to get used to when a season is training your palate. In the forests, smokehouses use standing deadwood whenever possible, because wood that's been seasoned on the stump burns much cleaner. Using fresh, green wood was always a last resort, because it wastes a huge amount of its own heat just boiling its own moisture before it ever starts cooking anything else. The Jesuit relations, those famous reports from the 17th century, are full of descriptions of snowshoe travel, longhouse life, and under-ice fishing among the Wendat and other peoples. The writers' frustrations with the new environment definitely show through, but so does their awe when they finally realized they were being pulled safely through the winter by a comprehensive plan they hadn't even known existed. Along the Columbia River system, the plateau peoples built mat lodges and pit houses depending on the season. And in those winter camps, the baskets were repaired and the nets were rehung. The quiet, repetitive work of making repairs hid the fact that every single stitch, written in reed and root, was keeping a kitchen running for when the storms inevitably piled up. An overlooked winter detail is the cooking sequence that saves fuel while still making varied meals. The stews and the grains would start first on the hottest part of the fire. Then, those same coals would be used to dry boots and to warm stones for overnight heating. One fire should always do more than one job. Along the sea ice, when the hunters returned, they would prop their harpoons where the kids couldn't trip over them, and where someone could see the condition of the lines without having to bend over for 5 minutes in the cold air. All those little bits of staging are what keep a camp from bleeding time, and in winter, time bleeds heat. Trade partners would time their visits to the woodlands towns for when the trails were at their best, and the ice was thick enough to serve as a highway. The sleds would then follow the same river curves that the summer canoes would later use in reverse, because the seasons change the vehicles much more than they change the routes. A late 19th century photograph of a Cree family shows them wearing wool coats under their traditional fur ruffs, with steel knives hanging from belts that were sewn with sinew. The blend wasn't a contradiction, it was an update, and the logic behind it looked exactly the same as it did centuries earlier. In Alaska's Seward Peninsula, winter houses were sometimes linked by tunnels. These let people move between buildings during a storm without ever stepping into the lethal wind. The tunnels also served as cold traps that kept the living spaces calmer, another case where a wall both protects and organizes. And in the prairies, after a blizzard, Lakota and Cheyenne camps would angle their tipis, so the morning sun would warm the entrance flaps just as the day's chores began. This small favor from the sky sped up the drying and cut down on the smoke, which can make a modest sunrise feel incredibly generous. The unseen warmth of routine. The quiet climax of all this detail isn't about heroism. It's about stability. That's a word that winter understands much better than summer does. Stability means a house that breathes, and a diet that balances, and a team that knows the drill. And drills are only boring until the moment they save you. By the time the spring light finally returned, the houses and the tools that had survived the winter had been tested under real, relentless pressure. This is why winter knowledge travels with such gravity. It's not just a collection of folklore, it's a record of choices that actually worked when failure cost far too much. The next morning's sky, after a clear, bitter night, might show sundogs those bright spots flanking the sun that announce ice crystals in the air and, often, more wind. The people who noticed that light would move their chores under a roof and tighten their lashings, a small adjustment that almost always paid off in comfort later. When the ice finally broke on the rivers, travel switched back to canoes and boats. But the winter routes didn't disappear from the mind. They just waited, like folded maps, for the first frost to return again. And the habits waited with them, ready to unfold right alongside the cold. Every region translated these 7 skills into its own dialect, but the verbs always stayed the same, in storm or in shine. Prepare, breathe, dry, share, pace, read, and repair. This is the grammar that wrote calm into the houses while the world outside went white. Modern tools can fit into that old grammar without breaking it. And when they don't fit, the grammar politely returns to the basics. A house that remembers to exhale, a coat that remembers to vent, a kitchen that remembers to stack its jobs, and a map that remembers the wind will never feel outdated. By the time the dawn starts returning earlier and the frost finally loosens its grip from the river stones, these lessons have already served their purpose. The people who followed them don't feel clever so much as they feel comfortable, which is a luxury you only notice when it goes missing. Winter does not reward speeches, but it always rewards those who show up prepared and stay attentive. And the reward is simple and profound at the same time. A warm room, a clear head, and a door that opens without any drama to a bright, bitter, beautiful day.